told that your reports are normal, but then your pain is very real. Today, this conversation is not just another awareness conversation. This episode is about correcting years of misunderstanding. Yes, this episode is going to cure or maybe correct your years of misunderstanding. It is for people who were told everything looks fine while they were still struggling every single month. Welcome to Healthcare Talk Show by Staffingly Inc. and the Practice Growth Engine. If you are a healthcare professional and would like to join our shows and grow your practice, you can check the description for details. And to help us understand why this happens, today we are joined by one of the country's leading experts in endometriosis and minimally invasive gynecologic surgery, Dr. Poulomi Guha. Dr. Poulomi Guha is a board-certified gynecologic surgeon based in Jacksonville, Florida. She completed her fellowship in minimally invasive gynecologic surgery at the prestigious Mayo Clinic School of Medicine. Dr. Guha holds dual fellowship honors as both a fellow of the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, known as FACOG, and a fellow of the American College of Surgeons, known as FACS. These dual fellowships recognize her expertise in both obstetrics and gynecology and advanced surgical technique. She specializes in complex endometriosis excision, adenomyosis, pelvic pain, and robotic-assisted laparoscopic surgery. Patients travel from across the Southeast to see her because she takes the time to listen when others have dismissed them. So without any further ado, let's welcome Dr. Guha to Healthcare Talk Show. Dr. Guha, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning to you too. And Dr. Guha, before we delve into the topic, I would like the audiences to know you a little better. So if you can please talk about your journey, if you can please tell our audiences about it.
So I have always I wanted to be a surgeon, and I'm also at the same time very passionate about women's health. So that's how I went into OBGYN residency, and minimally invasive GYN surgery is something like lacking even in many parts of US still now. Like to do simple cases like patients get like a big incision, but with minimally invasive surgery the recovery rate is so much better, the infection rate is so much less, patient go home the same day. So my patient get admitted like a couple of hours before their surgery and go home 2 hours after their surgery with pain management. So this is a very fascinating line how minimal invasive surgery has changed the way we do surgery nowadays compared to how we did like 20-25 years back. So that's what drew me to this minimal invasive GYN fellowship, where we learn laparoscopic surgery, robotic surgery, hysteroscopic surgery. So basically doing everything through tiny little holes so that the recovery is fast, the patient healing is fast, but you are doing an equally good job. I do most of my cases with the Da Vinci intuitive robot, which is equal as like laparoscopic in terms of like little incision, but it has 3D visualization. I'm able to do a way better job, which honestly I don't think I would be able to do in open cases. So basically it's like 4 or 5 times magnified than what we see with our naked eye when we are doing open cases. So all these attracted me to this particular field, and of course Mayo is one of the leading expert in this field, and that's how I chose my fellowship. And I did my fellowship from Mayo School of Medicine in Jacksonville, Florida, and I decided to stay back. This is like Northeast Florida, so I do have patients coming from from Georgia, from Southern Florida. We are really blessed to have a very good program in my hospital where we do give it's a center of excellence for minimal invasive surgery. Where we do give very passionate care to our women patients, with endometriosis.
I'm sure. I'm sure. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and for telling our audiences about your journey, Dr. Guha. Now, before I talk more about endometriosis and the problems related to that, before I do that, I would also like you to explain the viewers what exactly is endometriosis for the layman. I mean, because it's a very technical clinical word, right? So a lot of people might not understand what that means. So if you can please tell our audiences in a simple terms.
So, endometriosis is, think of it how I call it, inside out. So, the uterine lining is the lining which lines the inner lining of the uterus, which actually shed every month as your menstrual period. That kind of lining is deposited inside the abdomen, so outside the uterus. So, that's why inside out. The lining which was supposed to be inside the uterus, that get deposited outside the uterus in the pelvis. Actually, it can be in the bowel, it can be on your rectum, ovaries, like all over the abdomen. So the period blood comes out every month. But this lining, which is also bleeding inside the abdomen, it has nowhere to come out. So it is basically, it bleeds and cause inflammation inside your belly every month around the time of the period. And because of this inflammation, we have all the sequelae, meaning like the chronic pain. Some patients get it as like pain only during their period. Some people who have the endometriosis for a long time, because of the chronic scarring, they get it pain throughout the month. So like a chronic pelvic pain. This can also cause infertility because same thing of the scarring. So the inside out disease basically. And it's one of the most common cause. Like 50% of the cause of chronic pelvic pain is because of endometriosis. And it's a very undermined, not terminology, undermined cause of pain, because people usually get like a completely normal lab result, completely normal ultrasound, but you can't diagnose it without a laparoscopy. That's where my role comes.
Okay, okay. Guys, if you have been diagnosed by endometriosis and you have any questions for Dr. Guha, make sure to leave them in the comment section. And in our next episode, we are definitely going to take your questions and ask your questions from Dr. Guha. So, yes, please drop your questions in the comment section. And now, coming to my next question, 10 years, that is the average time to get an endometriosis diagnosis. And most of that delay happens before patients ever reach a specialist. So, Dr. Guha, when a woman finally gets to your office after years being dismissed, what do you do differently in that first appointment to make her feel heard?
So the first thing I do is I listen, because these women has gone to 10 other different doctors who dismiss their pain as, oh, you are a woman, you're supposed to have pain during your periods, just take this ibuprofen, or just take this pain medication, just use a heating pad, or take a couple of days off during your period. That's not normal. 6 to 9 out of 10 women who have painful period has endometriosis. So the first thing you do is listen, be compassionate, be empathetic, say yes, there is a cause. This is not normal. And in this era, most people have done a lot of research on social media. So all they want to listen is like, okay, somebody agrees that I might have endometriosis. And usually offer them, not like, okay, I'm going to give you a band-aid of like just be on birth control pill or pain medication. No, that's not the way to go. I say, well, let me diagnose it. Let me do a laparoscopy. I try to remove that fear of like a big surgery. When it's not a big surgery, it's a minimally invasive surgery, but you would know what is inside. Because sometimes, like ultrasound, you do MRI, it still might not show those initial stages of endometriosis, which you will find only on laparoscopy. So laparoscopy, whether you do it like straight stick or the robot, is the gold standard to diagnose endometriosis. So I give them that reassurance, okay, I will find it out for you. And based on that, we will decide the next line of management. And usually, excision surgery is the way to go, meaning I don't say, well, I'm going to diagnose it and not do anything about it. I say, I diagnose it and I remove it at the same time. So you know that's what you have, and your next line of treatment is based on that.
Okay, okay. Dr. Guha, is there, I mean, I'm being a complete layman over here. So, is there a particular age only after when endometriosis is diagnosed, or it can happen to any age, like people from any age?
So theoretically it actually has been found in a newborn also, basically. Well, that's very, very rare though. But generally, when you start your period, like around the age of like 12, 13, whatever, and you are having painful period, I mean, people usually say, okay, that's, we kind of ignore it. But statistically, adolescent population also can have 27 to 30% cases of endometriosis. Like 27 to 30% reason that they're having pain might be because of endometriosis. So endometriosis can start, the pain or the symptoms can start right when you start your period. Now, as you said, it takes on average 8 to 10 years to diagnose endometriosis. So by the time you find out, you might be already in your 20s or 30s, but it can start while you are a teenager, right when you start your period.
So also, I would like to address a myth over here. I don't know if it's a myth or if it's a truth. I mean, you are the better person to tell. So, does endometriosis only happen to women? Like, is it identified by labels, or it can happen to, I would say, maybe transgender men too? So, being a doctor, what do you say?
Meaning, if there's like one rare cases, that's different. But transgender men, meaning from female to male, yes, it can happen because it's that endometriotic tissue or the uterine lining. So yes, female, and then female to male transgender, yes, it can happen. But it's not always that uterine lining going backwards into the your belly to cause endometriosis. Sometimes it's like a genetic predisposition, meaning normal tissues in your belly can change into endometriosis also. So we have seen it even with patients. I'm not going into too much details, but we have seen it in patients even who have a congenital absence of uterus. But the main feeder is estrogen. So that's why females or female to male transgender will tend to have it, because it's the estrogen which feed the endometriosis, which is the female predominant hormone.
Right. Okay. Moving to my next question. So, a 2025 Medscape report shows 30% of OBGYNs are burned out. Another 23% are burnt out and depressed. The healthcare system is breaking both patients and providers. From your perspective, what is driving physician burnout in women health specifically?
So in women's health, remember, a majority of OBGYNs are actually female. So when it's a female, she's a doctor, she's a mother, she's a wife, she has to take care of like multiple things. So it's not only just seeing patients, but you have the demands of, okay, you have to take your kid there, or your husband is asking this. So one is that cause. Also, I think the medical legal environment related with this OBGYN specialty, especially with obstetrics, like, regarding delivery of babies and all. So, fortunately, I think people who give up obstetrics and go to just GYN only, like what I did, I think there is less chance. But when you do trying to do both, like obstetrics and gynecology, and take care of 10 different other problems, so does increase the risk of like burnout. Also, you know because of like today's situation, like 2025, the doctors are under a microscope. Like the press scan is scored. Like if the patient says, oh, she didn't give me attention, or she didn't do this, the hospital admin is coming after you, right? You are done with seeing patients, and there are like 20 messages in your inbox which needs to be addressed right today. Or like, oh, the notes has to be done in the next 24 hours. So that's kind of actually in general all specialty. But OBGYNs at the same time seeing patients are also called for a delivery. So in between seeing patients, she ran to do a C-section or ran to deliver a patient. So it's like your head is in 10 different directions. So, compared to other specialty, at least in United States, women's health is like underpaid compared to general surgeons. So a general surgeon might do an 1 hour surgery, but we might do a 4 hour endometriosis surgery. We are almost paid the same or different. It's not always about money, but why is that difference? So, women's health is an underpaid specialty in this country, and women's health is also under the radar of a lot of medical legal, like legal firms, getting sued. So the fear of getting sued, the fear of being held by the admins responsible for something. So We try to be perfect. We try to be like that type A personality, but that leads to burnout.
Okay, so Dr. Guha, there is one another myth that floats around. So I would like you to clear it out. So some people also say that pregnancy also cures endometriosis. What do you have to say about that?
The pregnancy actually does not cure the endometriosis, but pregnancy is kind of like a hypoestrogenic state, like where your periods stop. So that's why you tend to feel better. So it doesn't cure, but it keeps the condition kind of under control, because remember I said like estrogen is the most common, is the feeder. Also you're not having a period during that time, so that also kind of keep your pain kind of under control, because most patients have their pain mostly around the time of the period because of also the other inflammation associated with your period. So that's why people tend to feel better. It doesn't cure,
Okay, but it doesn't cure. You still have to go see the doctor.
depending upon how your symptoms are after you have your baby. So it has been seen statistically that if you have a lot of endometriosis, like after during pregnancy, some of those endometriotic lesions might regress. It doesn't go away. It's not like you can say it goes into remission. Maybe that's the right word, but it doesn't. It's not like disappear. But your symptoms does get better.
Okay, but then what are those symptoms that are still there for the women to find out that her endometriosis is still not cured?
Statistically, if your endometriosis surgery is done by an expert or a person who is trained in doing endometriosis surgery, your chance of recurrence rate is low. Now, there is not a like a good percentage that I can say, because there's not like any proper studies done, but statistically we have seen that the chance of recurrence might reduce to like less than 5%. But people who continue to be in pelvic pain, and if I know that her surgery was done by someone who is not trained in doing these kind of surgery, I will probably offer her, let me take a look inside again, or let me see if there are more endometriosis that needs to be excised. Because there is also a difference between like excision of endometriosis or doing a little burn or taking a little biopsy. That doesn't help. But if a patient comes to me and say that my surgery was done by this surgeon and I know that they are endometriosis surgeon, then I'll say, okay, there are other factors involved. Let me see if I can help with treating those factors instead of doing another surgery. Like doing surgery after surgery does not cure it. You have to do that one surgery by an expert who will excise like as much as they can and then do the maintenance therapy, because sometimes it's not just endometriosis. There is a lot of other factors involved which needs to be addressed also. It might be just part of like a chronic pain syndrome. So you might have autoimmune factor, you might have fibromyalgia, you might have pelvic floor dysfunction. Those needs to be corrected also. So if I just treat the endometriosis or do surgery on endometriosis and say bye bye to the patient, it's not going to help.
Okay, got it. So now let's talk about the office a little bit, because patient forums are full of women saying the same thing. Mostly all of them, I think they go through the same thing, and so they say the same thing. I called my doctor's office and no one answered. I left a message and never heard back, so I gave up. So how important is the office communication and accessibility for the patient when the patient is already scared and is in a lot of pain?
So it is extremely important how you answer that phone call. So like, when someone is calling, hey, I want to, because we do get those phone call like, oh, I want to see Dr. Guha, because I heard she did my friend's surgery and she's feeling better. So sometimes I have heard my office staff say, well, she has this much wait time. So there's a way of saying it, is the empathy. Yes, I completely understand that you have been waiting for this long. We're going to try our best to get you in. Usually, my front desk know to put patients on a cancellation list. So, like if someone else cancel, or suppose one of my surgery get canceled and I open clinic, we call them. Some patients are also waiting to see me because of infertility caused by endometriosis, and their fertility specialist has referred them to me to do the endometriosis surgery, and then they were going to try for pregnancy again and go for IVF. So these people are already in kind of like a emotionally, like, so you have to have that gentle voice, or you have to have that empathy in your voice when you answer. And it's not always in the doctor's hand, because I don't know what's going on in the front. But my job is to, like, time to time, train my front desk, or have my manager kind of have a discussion with them how we can address. And this is not only patients with endometriosis. I do a lot of fibroids also. This is like every patient, because when they are knocking your door, they're knocking it with a reason. So, and again, it's wrong to say that way, but it's kind of like good customer service also, right? Just because I'm a doctor, I cannot say that, oh, I'm the doctor, whatever. They are coming to me because they need me. So it's that good customer service. And every person in our office knows that. If we hear anyone like being rude, I myself like pull them back and talk, hey, have that empathy, think what would you want when you call a doctor's office.
100%. There's a saying that God can't be everywhere. That's why they created mothers. But I believe God can't be everywhere. That's why they created doctors. So, I mean, doctors do hold big responsibility, but of course, it does also come onto their front desk. So, and this happens quite a lot, and especially in the US, I've read such reviews actually from patients. So there was one review that I read, which said, this particular review that said the doctor was amazing, but the front desk was a nightmare. They scheduled me for the wrong day. I couldn't get through on the phone for a week. So now, you are a doctor, but still, being a doctor, I would like to ask you that how do front office challenges affect the care you are trying to provide, and what do you wish practices could do better?
So I think, like, how we can handle that. First of all, just like I said earlier, you have to train your front desk. But that wait time, or people showing up. So this has happened. Like, okay, my appointment is tomorrow, but by mistake I showed up, the day before. Or I was lost on my way to the hospital. Like, I work at Baptist. It's actually in the downtown area. You have to park and cross the cross bridge, and it takes like at least 10 minutes from the parking to come to our office, because you have to take the elevator, all those things. So patient do tend to get sometimes late, especially if it's a new patient and I'm already running behind. So I have always told them, don't say no to anyone. Don't say no. Tell them, ma'am, you might have to wait a little bit longer because she's already behind, and because you weren't on time. So, and I say, I'm going to stay as long as I can, try to address everything, help anyone I can, but they might have to wait a little bit. So they know that, don't say no, just have them. And in between, the next patient might cancel or might not show up, and then they get a entry on time anyway. But sometimes this patient has to go, might have another appointment, so then, like, we will reschedule. It's all about communication, like how you tell them. It's all about communication, whether it's the front desk, whether it's my surgery scheduler when they're calling the patient, or when it's the doctor patient interaction. It's like that communication in very simple words.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's a great advice, actually. So, thank you for that great advice, Dr. Guha. And, the AMA says physicians complete 39 prior authorizations per week. That's 13 hours of staff time that could be spent on patient care. So, when insurance denies or delays authorization for endometriosis surgery, what happens to your patients?
So one big obstacle of healthcare in United States is the insurance, the finance. So unlike Canada or the European countries, we don't have socialized medicine. So you have to have a good insurance. And also, like the hospital I work at, or when I was at Mayo, we accept only commercial insurance, or there are certain insurance that we do not accept. So that's a big barrier, because endometriosis doesn't judge by what insurance. If you're a rich person, so you have a good insurance, so I'm going to be in your tummy. They don't judge by that. So that's a big hindrance. There Nowadays I'm not getting that much restriction from or problem from the insurance company because endometriosis is a well-known disease now. But I have done in the past a lot of peer-to-peer, because when they're seeing like authorization thing, they're seeing that, oh, this patient does not have any abnormality on the ultrasound, so why is she like planning on doing a surgery? So I have done peer-to-peer with other physicians who are on the other side, like who works for insurance company, and many times they are not OBGYNs. So I have to like break them in simple terms. Hey, you cannot find it just by doing an ultrasound. You might have to do a laparoscopy. And then they will say, oh, why are you not using straight stick? Why are you using robot? Well, I say, well, the robot do a three-dimensional things I cannot see with laparoscopy or like a simple straight stick camera. I will be able to see with that powerful robot camera. So it's a lot of like again comes communication, like how you explain the insurance party, like, okay, this patient needs that surgery. Where I cannot do anything is like when they don't have insurance. We do offer like a self pay, but see, that's not doesn't depend upon me. The hospital has to allow them also. So sometimes like our hospital where we work, they do have like a charity thing. Going through that is another nightmare. So I think the biggest obstacle is insurance. I mean, when they come to me and they have the right insurance, I will get it done somehow. I will fight with the hospital, I'll fight with the insurance company, I will get it done. That's me. But they have to reach my office, and they cannot reach my office if they don't have the right insurance. And even if you do self pay to like see me, but then like the self pay is a very nominal amount. How am I going to do surgery? Because for the surgery, I need the hospital, and the hospital has to let them.
Actually, yes, 100%. Actually, this happens. But, I think, Dr. Gua, not a lot of channels and not a lot of, I can say, podcasts and interviews or shows talk about these issues, right? They do talk about, I mean, gynecological problems and endometriosis. But these are some issues where not a lot of people, talk about. So thank you so much for, talking so patiently and openly about all of these issues and actually clearing out all the misunderstanding. But this actually brings me to my another question. This is not related to insurance or anything, but before I ask you my question, guys, if you have faced such similar situations, or if you have been to a doctor and have heard such answers, make sure to drop them in the comment section and make sure to let us know that what all problems have you been through, or what all problems have you faced, and what have you heard from the front desk or maybe from the doctor. And yes, do subscribe to Healthcare Talk Show. Dr. Bora, coming back to you, when such problems happen, sometimes women also get confused who to go to, as in, do they see a male OBGYN or do they go to a female OBGYN? So as I mean, you are a doctor, so who would you recommend, being a doctor?
So, see, my recommendation is, if you are seeing particularly for like endometriosis, or particularly for fibroid, or particularly for hormone replacement, see someone who is well trained in it. So, like for example, endometriosis, I have no problem going to a male versus female, provided that doctor is well trained and well versed in the condition that I'm going to him for. So, I have a lot of male colleagues that are, though, who are very well trained in endometriosis surgery. And this is true, like culturally or in general, female likes to go to a female. That's just how OBGYN is. And I'm sure, if it's a male condition, they would want to go to a male doctor, right? Especially if it's related to something like a personal thing, like a genital organ. That's, to go to a cardiologist, people don't differentiate between male and female. But, if I am trying to find a doctor, that's just me. I will just try to find someone who is good in that. So I don't think there should be a gender discrimination based on that. It should be based on like your training and what you are an expert in, not the gender. But it's a normal thing. People do tend to go to female, like female will tend to go to a female.
I mean, that's completely and purely out of comfort, right? Only because they are more comfortable telling their problem, sharing their problem, and also to feel that the female doctor would understand their situation much better.
That is true, but I have, meaning my attendings when I was doing fellowship, both my chairperson, program director, and my co fellow were males, and they were wonderful. But it is true, like, like if you say, well, I have very painful period, or when I'm doing the exam, like because I'm a female, I feel like, okay, I know this is going to hurt more than that. So you are, I think females have a little bit more empathy because we are mothers also. So, but there should not be gender discrimination based on that. That's just like I feel it should not be based on that. But because of the patient's perspective, OBGYN is a very women dominated field now. But it's still in surgery. I'm not going to say like general surgery, it's still like very, very male dominated. So why don't GYN surgery be female dominated? What's wrong in that? But that's been me talking like a feminist. So I don't, I'm not a feminist.
No, absolutely, absolutely, guys. I don't want to get into any trouble over here. I'm not drawing any comparisons between the two or maybe favoring one over the other. I'm not being gender biased. Whoever you are comfortable to, please go see them, regardless of their gender. Who you think fits your criteria or your category? Please go ahead and see them, right, doctor?
Because there are really like I have a lot of male colleagues who are very, very good, like, so. But in general, in OBGYNs it's mostly female. So, but as I said, like my attendings, my co-fellows, they were all like males, and I had a wonderful experience, not as a patient doctor relationship, but being a co-fellow, and I've seen them, seeing other female patients, I've seen them operating. I think they do a equally good job.
Okay, so maybe this is one question that our audiences can answer better. Guys, drop your answers in the comment section and tell us. So, who do you go and see? If you have a female doctor or a male doctor, please let us know in the comment section and make sure to subscribe to Healthcare Talk Show. Let's move on to our next question. So, 81% of prior auth denials get overturned on appeal. That means the original denial was wrong 4 out of 5 times. So, doctor, why does the system make patients and physicians fight for care that eventually gets approved anyway?
You should ask that to those insurance companies, right? Why do they make our lives so difficult when we can just see patients and not go through this prior authorization, peer to peer and all that. So that's how the system in this country, and I don't think any doctors support it, but that's how the system is. And that's why we have companies like you helping us with the prior authorization. But this is not only in surgeries, it's like every medication, every specialty. Fortunately, in OBGYNs, it is not that much. But you cannot imagine, like in primary care, like diabetic medication, blood pressure medication, the amount of prior authorization they have to do. And it's like staying on the phone for like an hour or two. Even with my surgeries, I have seen my surgery scheduler be on the phone. Like I went to tell her something. She's like, "Wait, Dr. Gore, don't talk because, I'm on the phone." Like 40 minutes on hold for a prior authorization, which is a straight cut case of endometriosis, needs surgery, but they're on the hold. So that's why, we have a wonderful virtual assist company like you guys who can help us out with those. But this is like how the system is made. And I feel is getting worse day by day. So I'm not saying socialized medicine is better option, like how they have in Canada and all, because they have their own drawbacks. But this is like insurance company, it's not the hospital, it's not the doctors, it's the insurance companies.
Do you think that this is an area where the US healthcare should work on to make it better?
See, I mean, of course, and now we have fortunately, like if I'm doing peer to peer with another physician, they understand and they will approve it. But they are also answerable to the insurance company on how much money they can save by refusing a medication or refusing a surgery. But I'll tell you, like, when we took the Hippocrates oath, like we want to help everyone, irrespective of insurance, irrespective of, gender, money, anything. But it's just a system. And, and I don't think it's going to change anytime soon because healthcare anything with healthcare is a big business here.
Absolutely, no, that's true, and 100%. I think maybe this is the reason why it is more business driven.
It's very business driven.
Yeah. Mhm.
Very, very business driven. Like if you don't have a good job, you don't have a good insurance, you can't see our doctor. So actually, we have a like a health portal, which means like once you see me, like you can write to me directly through the portal. So young patients who just need like a birth control refill, or like a simple thing like a yeast infection, like a very simple thing like which I can take care of on the phone or through the portal, I will say them, okay, you don't have insurance for this period, write to me, see if I can help you, through the portal, or just calling you. And then if needed, sometimes I will see them at a discounted self-pay rate. But I try to volunteer also. There are many volunteer organization in Jacksonville, not in Jacksonville, everywhere in the country actually, where we do tend to see patients like people who are don't have insurance. But the problem is that I cannot do surgery, or someone needs a biopsy, I cannot do those procedures. So just me telling the patient like, okay, you need this, but there is a limit to that. At certain point, you have to see the patient. If they have a real thing going on, you might have to do surgery. Now how do you do that? You have to then depend on the insurance.
That's actually also sounds, a little sad too, right, doctor? You want to help the patient, but then there is this business culture or corporate culture that is involved here, and which where you don't know what to do, and whether to be a doctor, whether to be the right citizen, following.
Yes, it's like, you're taught to help, like help everybody, help everyone, but then you feel you're limited. Then we try to send patients to like county hospitals here, like where they will do without insurance if it's like an emergency situation. But like the other day I heard even they are asking for a upfront insurance, like, or upfront money. I mean, there are people who cannot afford, whether they're going to pay their rent, or their kids daycare, or whether they're going to pay the doctor.
Okay, so exactly, because there is this data that says some practices now have staff who work exclusively on prior authorization. 40% of physicians report this according to the AMA. So, is prior authorization, do you think is prior authorization something your practice has to dedicate significant resources to? And how does that affect everything else? I mean, you have like told that how you deal with it being a doctor, but then when you have to dedicate a lot of your resources just to it, then how does it affect everything else?
Patient gets mad, that's what happens, right? Suppose I sent a prescription, as I said, like, my feel, if I'm doing just the surgery part, not so much, but there are certain medication, we use even for endometriosis, like post-operatively, sometimes, before they are going to start trying for pregnancy, which is not a whole lot like what we have to do in primary care, like for diabetic and blood pressure medication, in insulin and all that. But still, you know that's like my medical assistant being on the phone for like 2 hours, and then sometimes they are not able to reach the person they have to call, and then okay, so that get delayed for another 2 days, something else comes up. So now the patient is sending angry messages that, oh, you have sent that prescription 2 weeks back, what's going on, I paid for your visit, I you know and then I still don't have the medication, because not everyone understands that, what we have to go through to get that medication done, though they should be calling their insurance company, right? Like, why are you making that, the situation so difficult for my healthcare provider that I'm not getting the medication? So that's where I think the role of our virtual assistants come, because they can work behind the scene to get this done, whether my office resources can actively help me seeing patients.
Okay. Doctor, insurance companies require patients to try cheaper treatments first, right? Even when surgeons know they won't work. Step therapy for endometriosis can delay real treatment by years. So, how do you navigate step therapy requirements when you know your patient needs surgery now, not after failing three medications?
Meaning endometriosis, when I'm seeing the patient, they have already gone through medications already, which has failed, and now they are at my door and we are planning on surgery. So There are generic version of many, for example, after surgery we try to suppress their period with like continuous birth control pill. Sometimes we do like a progesterone iud. All those things helps with kind of suppression of endometriosis. So there are generic version also, which though cheap but works pretty well, especially the fda approved one. So we do that quite a bit. But my patient population doesn't need that much because usually I do the surgery, but there are other, I usually send them back to my referring provider and they have to deal with that part. But in endometriosis, we don't have a whole lot. When the problem comes, when they have to be referred to a fertility specialist, and all those fertility drugs are almost never covered by insurance. So many of these endometriosis patients will need IVF to get pregnant just because their tubes were involved, or I have to remove the tubes, or their ovaries were involved, so their ovarian reserve is low, so they will have to go through IVF to get pregnant. Now none of these drugs, none of them are covered. And I know, like, my fertility colleagues, they do generic medication, which might be, sometimes I feel the generic medication might not work as well, or might have like a little bit more side effect. I don't have to deal with it, but because it's like fertility, which I don't do, I just do the surgeries, but it does affect patient care. But at least you're getting something is better than nothing.
Right, right. But then, do like these medications, can it worsen the situation? If a person is diagnosed with endometriosis, and but then because of insurance they are having to, I mean, they have been asked to take these cheap medications. So do you think that those cheap medications and those things can affect the endometriosis, can it make it worse?
Not really. So, because if the most we have to use is like birth control pill. Like this is, I'm talking to you just in perspective to endometriosis. There are other conditions where the generic drug not make it worse, might not work as well. But in endometriosis, honestly, it does not matter that much. If we are doing a good excision surgery, we do recommend patients to be on birth control pill, but the generic ones work pretty well. But there are certain patients, like, there are 1,001 birth control pill in the market. So if one person has side effect with one particular one, the other might work. So here you are limited. Like, okay, so the generic medication is not working, or the cheaper version is not working. I want to use this particular brand, which might be more effective, or which might be more tolerable to the patient. But now your hands are tied, you cannot do that. That doesn't, I'm not going to say that will make endometriosis worse. I mean, I think that's more pertinent to like diabetes or hypertension, where it can things make worse if you're not taking the right medication, not necessarily endometriosis.
Okay, moving to the next question. Excision has a recurrence rate under 20% when done by an expert. Ablation has a 40 to 60% recurrence rate within 2 years. In simple terms, what is the difference between excision and ablation, and why should patients ask their surgeon which technique they should use?
So definitely excision is the gold standard. Definitely. There's no doubt about it. You don't have to do a study. This basically like common sense. So in ablation, you are using laser, or you're using just heat to like just burn the lesion. So you're not removing it. So if you are not using the adequate amount of heat, which you cannot say when you are using it, you will have the lesion still. Like you might ablate like a part of it, 80% of it, but there's still like active cells left, which will grow. Because the endometriosis are in a reproductive age women, right? They're producing estrogen. So an estrogen is the feeder. Now it might work if you are in like almost about to go into menopause, because then your endometriosis secretion will slow down, but not in young patients. So excision is where we are removing the whole lesion, the whole visible lesion. And I've been a robotic surgeon, and I do like almost 90% of my endometriosis surgery with the robot. It can show like those subtle lesions which might not be causing any problem now, but might be in the future. So those subtle lesions, I mean, of course you have to excise it. The other problem with ablation is like, especially when you are using heat, while trying to use heat, you may damage structure underneath. For example, there might be nerves underneath when under the endometriotic lesions. There might be the ureter, which is like the pipe which brings the urine from the kidney to the bladder. It might be underneath. So while burning it or while ablating it, you might damage those structures. In excision, what we do, we are basically separating the nerve, separating the ureter before we extract just the endometriotic lesion. In our fellowship, that's what we are trained to, like, remove abnormal stuff, keep the normal stuff. You cannot do that in ablation because you might be burning both together. So definitely excision is the gold standard, no doubt about it. And that's why the recurrence rate is low. And also I said, like, even if you're doing excision, if it's done by like the appropriate person who knows how to look for those lesions or who knows how to recognize those lesions, that has even less recurrence rate. I know you quoted like 20% for excision, but done by the appropriate surgeon, the recurrence rate is even less. Meaning, I cannot give you a right number. One of the studies says like less than 10% or 5%, but because you are recognizing it. That's why you have to go to that person who knows how to recognize it. Because all endometriotic lesions are not like how it shows on the Google, like a little brown spot. There are different versions of how it looks. So you have to, like, what the mind doesn't know, eyes cannot see. So you have to know that's how the endometriosis look and excise it.
Right, right. But then, doctor, how does how should a person identify that this doctor is the correct doctor for? I mean, based on what criteria, or based on like what all certificates should they identify that I should be going to this doctor?
The first thing I will do, like if I am a patient, I find out whether she is like fellowship trained. Now, I'm going to acknowledge that there are, like, I know many of my colleagues like who might not have gone through a fellowship, but they have been trained under like a really good surgeon who does endometriosis surgery. So they have done it with them. So though it is not like an accredited fellowship, but they have been trained by this person who I know is a good endometriosis surgeon. So I will trust them. Believe me, because of social media, patients are very, very smart now. So there are ways to find out. But also, and again, I should not say you should go by Google reviews, because I'm not going to say they're not always correct or incorrect. You should talk with people who I have done surgery on or who that particular surgeon have done surgeries on. So I know it is difficult though. It is difficult. Like, I'm saying this because, I've been a physician. I know who does what, but it is very difficult for common people to figure that out. I mean, most people don't know also about endometriosis, like I said, like you said, like unless you're having pain and you're Googling and then you say, oh, I have this symptom. So probably I have endometriosis. So many patients are actually coming to me saying, well, I asked Chat GPT, I have this, I have pain, I have bloating, I have pain during intercourse, I have, all these symptoms. And then Chat GPT said, I have endometriosis. So that's why, I'm here. Because so it is difficult to find that right person. But the main thing I will look for is whether that person is fellowship trained to do these kind of surgeries. Because in residency, which is like that 4 years of OBGYN residency, you don't get enough training because you are doing, OB also, which is like the baby and the delivery. And then you don't have much time to do surgeries when you are in residency because it's very OB predominant, OB meaning like obstetrics predominant. And also in general practice, when you are doing obstetrics and gynecology, you're probably not able to concentrate on one over the other. So obstetrics and gynecology are two very separate situations. They are connected only because you GYN and then you get pregnant, but it's a completely different situation. So that's why we have these fellowship that people who want to do like obstetrics, they do like high risk pregnancy, maternal fetal medicine, or they do the general OB practice. And then we have the GYN who goes to like fellowships like like I did.
Thank you so much, doctor, for answering that question. I mean, I think it's going to be a great help for our viewers and our audiences. And guys,
Then I do. And again, the other thing I forgot to mention that, like, and people, like, there are like Facebook groups, right? Like, or what that channel thing is, Reddit. So all these like groups, they have like people discussing like, well, who was your OBGYN, who did this, who did that. And patient will come and say, well, I got your name from Reddit, or I got your name from this Jacksonville moms group because somebody mentioned that you were really nice, and yeah, all that.
okay. I mean, sometimes it does help, but then I think for the most of it, it also backfires.
But see, like not in endometriosis. Like I have old patients come with like, okay, doctor, I saw this lesion on the on my private parts, and according to like ChatGPT, like the Google Lens, the Google Lens, right? So that according to that picture looked like cancer. So last month I had an old patient do that, and it was actually vulvar cancer. She took a picture and she asked Google, not asked, like Google Lens. So she was actually right. I mean, it was very obvious, like cancer looking, when I examined her anyway. But she didn't go to OBGYN for like years, just because she's older, she's already in menopause, and she just see her general practitioner. But she came because of that, and it was cancer. I think it helps also, meaning in a certain way. But Google reviews are not right. That's what I was trying to say. One good reason of that burnout is because of the stupid Google reviews. Because you might be good, but your front desk sucks. So is that your fault? How can you handle like 10 different people? See, my practice is like a smaller practice, and it's my private practice, so it's easy. But when you are working for a big hospital, you have no control who is at the front desk. No control. They do what the admin says. So they say something wrong, but then the review come to the doctor, and then the admin comes after you. Oh, your PET score was bad, or you should call the patient, not apologize, but you should explain. I mean, why? I mean, someone is obese, and you're telling them, hey, you should try to lose weight. Well, who is going to say other than your doctor? Because everything is related. Even with endometriosis, when I'm doing surgery on like a 40 BMI patient compared to if I'm doing like a 20 BMI like small patient, of course my life will be easier. Risk of complication of the bigger patient is more, not only with anesthesia but chance of blood clots, everything. But you say
I think
that.
the world has become too sensitive now. That's
Yeah,
true.
even if you're like, I mean, who else is going to say? I mean, if you're coming to my office with a big Starbucks coffee, of course I'm going to say you're trying to lose weight and you're drinking that coffee right in the morning.
Yeah.
And that comes on your Google review. They will say, oh, she hurt my emotions. So you are under the microscope, basically.
Can't really believe what you go through on daily basis.
I mean, you have to become like, thick skin, honest. And then the other thing, taking herbal supplements. Worst thing you can do. We had a patient recently went into liver failure. She was taking something for like, painful periods, took too much because, there's no dosage on it, and went into liver failure. These all these like Ayurvedic medication, which, we used to see as a kid when I was in India, like they are here now, and they are being sold in all these like expensive vitamin store in like nicely packaged, which I've seen in India. And now it's like
Wow.
that happens all the time. Like all these like Brahmi, Ashwagandha, like whatever. Like I remember seeing it in like little villages or on the streets being sold. They are in like nicely packaged, all expensive. I mean, there's no studies done. I mean, they might work. I'm not saying they don't work. Like, things, for example, like, that methi thing people do to reduce their blood sugar. Methi doesn't have any bad effects. They're probably going to work. But there are certain like herbs, and I don't know, like people take it to reduce their menstrual pain. I mean, if you're taking too much, that's of course going to affect liver. Just because a leaf is bitter doesn't mean it's nutritious. I remember like mom saying, "Oh, this is like bitter, so it's going to, it's good for your liver." No, because there's no studies done. There's no studies done to say what is the highest dose, what is the lowest dose. Or the Chinese medication, the Chinese things which will work on the cow, which will work on the cow with four compartment of the stomach is not going to work on human being. And and there are certain things also depends upon the age. Some of these medication increase your blood pressure, right? So you might be having benefit in one aspect, but then in increase your blood pressure. There are certain medication people take for like hair loss can affect your thyroid function. I've seen that so many patients. The other thing, is the high volume surgeon, meaning you might be 60 years old, but if you're doing, some of these, like my, general GYN, they are doing surgeries, maybe like one hysterectomy in 3 months or one endo excision like in 6 months. Now some people like are all about themselves, like talking about it. But, you might be just, 5 years out of fellowship, but you might be doing, over 150. Like I do like laparoscopic, robotic, lot of open cases like for big fibroids like fibroid tumors. So and approximately I perform like maybe 300 surgeries a year. So but it's the amount which matters.
Some surgeons see surface disease. Fellowship trained specialists find endometriosis 5 millimeters deep on the bowel near diaphragm. When you operate, what hidden disease do you commonly find that previous surgeries or imaging missed, doctor?
So, endometriosis can be superficial, like how you mentioned. It can be like deep, where it is basically more than 5 millimeter deep, or actually, by definition, more than 3 meter deep. So, that's called deep infiltrating endometriosis. So, but remember, like superficial endometriosis and deep infiltrating endometriosis can be kind of equally painful, though deep infiltrating endometriosis is more difficult to remove because they are deeper, so you have to like do more dissection. Sometimes they are near like vital structures like bowel, ureter, so you have to know really how to do a good job on them, otherwise you're going to get into complications of like bleeding, injuring the ureter, injuring the bowel. So when I'm doing these surgeries, I am doing like a complete inspection. I'm not just, okay, let me see what's like by the side of the uterus and I'm done. I start with like a complete inspection. So I start with, right when the laparoscope or the camera goes in, I start with looking at the upper abdomen where the diaphragm, liver, gallbladder, stomach. So basically, if I see anything on the diaphragm, if it's something I can do, I will do it, or I will call my general surgery colleague to take care of it. Because sometimes it might be on the liver, and I would like to be medico legally correct, at least, because sometimes it's like, why my GYN operated on my liver. So I'm doing a thorough inspection, and patients where I know I'm suspecting that they might be on the diaphragm, like based on their breathing, or like they were operated by another surgeon who said, well, it was on the diaphragm and we didn't remove it. I will coordinate the surgery with someone who can take care of it if I'm not able to. For example, like if it's on the liver or something. That happens all the time. So I have a few general surgeons I work with. They know my like how we do surgeries. So when I say, well, hey, can you be in during the time? So my scheduler will coordinate with their scheduler to schedule those surgeries. Now, then I go into the lower abdomen. Sometimes, there might be endometriosis little here and there, which they have removed it, but it might be on the appendix. 30 to 40% patients with endometriosis have endometriosis on the appendix also, which is such a easy surgery. Appendectomy is such a easy surgery, but it is one of those infiltrating endometriosis. And I will call the general surgeon to remove it. Sometimes I will do if they are not available because it's a pretty easy. Then I will look around the ureter, underneath the ovary, because you have to like kind of go to all those pelvic spaces. I go around the bladder. Sometimes, if I'm looking inside the bladder also at the end of the surgery with something called cystoscopy to see if there's any inside bladder lesions which I might not see on laparoscopy. Okay, so basically, it's thorough inspection of all the way from diaphragm to your pelvic floor, like everything. I'm removing endometriosis even from the fallopian tube, which is like the little tube which carries the egg from ovary to the uterus. You need them to get pregnant, especially in endometriosis patient where one of the cause of infertility is that. Also, another situation we see, and I want people to be aware of it, because of the scarring from endometriosis, there might be a situation called hydrosalpinx, where the fallopian tube get all dilated and all. Recently, I did a case where she had hydrosalpinx, and that hydrosalpinx has to be removed before they try for pregnancy, or they try IVF, because that hydrosalpinx, if it's a true hydrosalpinx with all fluid inside the fallopian tube, that can actually cause miscarriage of a healthy pregnancy. Recently saw a patient, so she already had surgery, but they left her hydrosalpinx because they were worried that I'll remove it and what the patient will think. So it's a lot of like counseling the patients or setting up the expectation before the surgery that, hey, if you have a true hydrosalpinx, I might have to remove it because you're going to try for pregnancy. So, they might not be direct endometriosis, but they are sequelae to endometriosis. So these are the things I'm going to look for. And again, it depends upon what's the age group, what are they looking for. So another situation is adenomyosis, which is just endometriosis of the uterus. So if you might like you take care of the endometriosis, but if you still have the uterus, you are going to be in pain. So you have to recognize that. So if a patient has already completed childbearing, I do give them the option. Okay, I can remove endometriosis from the pelvis, but the adenomyosis, if it's all over the uterus, I might not be able to take care of it. There are medical management, but if you want, we can do a hysterectomy at the same time. So it might be not those deep lesions, but it might be one of the cause of pain. You do a whole endometriosis excision, but if she has adenomyosis, which is like endometriosis of the whole uterus, she will continue to feel pain. Even if you do a beautiful excision of endometriosis all over the pelvis, she'll still continue to be in pain. So also recognizing that during the laparoscopy or during your initial inspection. So basically, I tell patients anything abnormal, I will remove it. Anything normal, I will keep. So on the bowel also, like recognizing it. Now, if it's like a little lesion, I will take care of it. If it's a deep lesion, which needs like sometimes, like removal of part of the bowel, depending upon how much it is involved, I will call a general surgeon. We do a preoperative MRI to look for it. Sometimes I'll send patients for a colonoscopy where basically somebody is looking from the inside of the colon to see if there's any like possible endometriosis, and based on that I will coordinate the surgery with a general surgeon or someone who can, or a colorectal surgeon who can help me with the excision. So our goal is like one surgery. This is your one chance to take care of as much as possible, or completely so that she doesn't have to go through surgery after surgery. That's what happens when you are going to someone who's not doing a adequate excision or who's not taking care of the whole disease. That's why you go through surgery after surgery. So it's your one chance to take care of anything possible which is abnormal or might be causing pain.
Okay, so guys, now you know which doctor to go to. So there you have it. If you're going through such problems or such issues, make sure to reach out to Dr. Paulomi Guha. She'll be there to help you out. And thank you so much. That's a very informative answer, Dr. Guha. Thank you for being here. It was a great episode. We do have a lot of other questions to also cover, but we are going to do it maybe in our next episode. But for today, I think that's it. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. You guys have a wonderful day.
You too. Thank you.